I caught up with those entries that arrived while I was away, Lady Zaradnik. What do you think? Ludmilla asked. They were interesting, Nemil said. It was disappointing to find out that Elena didn't qualify for the 897th Annual Axis Championship. Obviously, the biggest shock was finding out that the nice guy who kept visiting her at the Imperial Archive was actually the Crown Prince. And now they're getting married. It's a development you'd usually only find in romantic fiction. Eh? What are you talking about? Dimouio asked. Is there a new volume of Dreams of Red? Frianne gently stroked the fluffy thing on her lap while listening to the other women chat. It had been less than half a year since the latest volume of the popular novel series had been officially released, but the dreamer lived in the Sorceress Kingdom and Lady Zaradnik possessed an advance copy of the previous volume during her visit to the Empire. Her getting her hands on another advance copy was entirely possible. I don't think so, Nemil said. It's not written like Dreams of Red. They're more like the diary entries of someone who lived in the distant past, except the civilization that this woman lived in seems to be far more advanced than anything I know of. Are they from another part of the continent? They refer to geographical features in our region, Nemil said. I can only assume that she's from around here, except I'm not familiar with any of the places that would tell us exactly where. What features does she mention? Dimouio asked. The Azalizia Mountains is one of them. The Cerulean Way, as well. There's no mention of Riastais or the Baharuth Empire? No. Carnassus is mentioned once, though. If Carnassus is mentioned as a country, Rangobut said, then that woman lived sometime before the demon gods. It's strange that Baharuth isn't mentioned. Don't our histories claim that the empire existed before Riastais? Aristais claims that Riastais existed before the demon gods, too, Ludmilla said. That's clearly a lie, Rangobart scoffed. It's a sliver of the truth, at best. House Vaself invaded from Carnassus to conquer the lands left devastated and weak in the wake of the demon gods. Some of the houses of Riastais may have existed where they were before the time of the demon gods, but House Vaself usurped the lands of the original empire. So that's where this diary is from, then? Dimouio asked. The original empire? It could be, Ludmilla said. But we can't figure out how old the entries are. They use their own calendar and a diary doesn't exactly give readers a primer on the period it's written in. What about the dwarves? Frianne asked. Shouldn't they have some records of the old empire? They do, Ludmilla said. The problem is that they aren't very helpful beyond knowing that the Azalisian mountain dwarves once had a thriving trade relationship with the country that existed on both sides of the Azalisia mountains. That trade relationship was so ancient that the oldest ledgers have long disintegrated. From what we can tell, trade with the old empire was already thriving before the advent of the six great gods. It's impossible to pin when this diary was written with what has been translated so far. Should a diary take all that long to translate? One could just use a translation spell. Ludmilla shook her head. Translation spells don't work, she said. It's written in something similar to the aristocratic cipher that some nobles like to play around with. Frianne's mind went back to the arrival of Countess Corlin's party at the Imperial Palace, which led to their eventual meeting with Frianne's grandmother. Wait, Frianne said. Is this related to the dangerous history that you discussed with the Dowager Duchess? It is, Ludmilla nodded. Since then, Corlin has labeled this language as High Imperial. But then we found out that a simplified form of it is spoken in the Draconic Kingdom. Queen Auriculus told us that it's known as Low Draconic, a form of Draconic that was the world's common language before the coming of the 8 Greed Kings. That's quite the puzzle you have on your hands, Rangobart said. It's just the sort of thing that bards, nobles, and sages would sink all their resources into solving. But why is it dangerous? Because people who try to figure out this puzzle tend to die, Ludmilla told them. Dimouio clapped her hands over her ears. Rangobart crossed his arms over the table and leaned forward. How do they die, exactly? He asked. Some sort of ancient curse? Assassins, as far as I know, Ludmilla shrugged. The ancient enemy of this ancient empire is still around and it seems intent on erasing any record and memory of its existence. We still haven't any clue why. Frianne considered the presented points. Nemil mentioned that the civilization of the ancient empire was highly advanced, more advanced than the present-day countries that she knew of. The most apparent motive was that the ancient enemy was a rival of the ancient empire and still feared its resurrection even after untold centuries had passed. Once in a while, though less frequently as time went on, ancient ruins would be discovered in the region. It was well known that such ruins tended to contain wealth and relics from ages past, and most of those relics were beyond the artifice of present-day industry. Every country had a few of those artifacts, though the ones in the empire belonged to one noble house or the other. Those who wielded them were far too dangerous for the empire to challenge. The glaring omission in the discussion was the Sorceress Kingdom's stake in the investigation. The Sorcerer King's claim to the Irantal region was supposedly ancient, so the Sorcerer King could very well know more than Ludmilla was letting on. This presented several possibilities. One was that the Sorcerer King was the ancient enemy and the investigation was simply bait to fish up any would-be investigators and use them to sweep up leftover bits of information. With the Sorceress Kingdom now exerting control over the area once occupied by the ancient empire, the ancient empire would be definitively lost to history. Another possibility was that the Sorcerer King represented a surviving fragment of the ancient empire. The absurd military might of the Sorceress Kingdom and its robust defensive infrastructure might be preparations to fight a war of the ancients that would make the demon god's rampage seem like a minor goblin raid. Should I include that in my report? No. That might end up in a dead court council. It's something better shared in private with Jerkniv. Maybe his hair would start falling out again. Was there even a point in knowing? The Empire could do nothing if a war between these ancient powers erupted, so ignorance was bliss. The third major possibility was that the Sorcerer's Kingdom was quietly investigating the ancient empire and its ancient enemy to see what sort of threat it might represent. That could also explain its ongoing military preparations. If so, how did the Empire figure into the scenario? Were they simply a buffer state to stall intruders from the east? Was that why the Sorceress Kingdom had pushed to integrate Death Series servitors into the Imperial Army? Once, the powerful undead made it seem like the Empire would be secure in perpetuity. Now, she wasn't so sure. Maybe that's why the Katza Plains exists, Dimir said. A war so terrible was fought there that it turned into a permanent negative energy zone. The histories do say something to that effect, Rangobard said. They don't mention the cause of the war or what used to be there. Every country in the region has a claim on the Katza Plains, though. What if they were all once a part of the old empire? Nemel asked. Wouldn't that be sad? Sad? Yes, sad. It could be that the countries here are all fragments of the old empire and now we just squabble over a past we can't remember. A family that has forgotten that it's a family. Rangobart cleared his throat. House Gran may be nice and peaceful internally, he said, but many families to this day squabble over inheritance. Nemel gave Rangobart a sour look. Her sentiment was nice, but Rangobart was right. If someone had convincingly reconstructed this forgotten history and presented it to the countries in the region, it would likely just become yet another source of conflict. It could be that the Sorceress Kingdom is creating this new hegemony for precisely that reason. An acceptable middle ground that recognizes the history that has established itself since then. What do you think about all of this, Zaradnik? Frian asked. As with many things, Ludmilla answered, we are still learning about it. Politically speaking, my duty is to uphold national policy regardless of the outcome. Frian supposed that should have been the expected response. The Sorceress Kingdom was the preeminent power in the region. The slain theocracy, which should have been the power to oppose their rise, remained adamantly neutral on any matter involving the Sorcerer's Kingdom. There was Argoland, as well, but they had a well-documented policy of non-interference. It must be nice to live so worry-free. If they had still been nobles of Riestais, switching allegiances to the theocracy or the empire would have been a real consideration. Their territories were sitting in the heart of the contested claim, after all, and Riestais didn't stand a chance against any of its neighbors in a serious conflict. With the Sorceress Kingdom, however, loyalty was the best policy. It was other countries that had to worry about losing pieces of themselves to it, which was one of the major reasons why the emperor had capitulated so quickly. Nobles disgruntled with Jerkniv's rule had no chance to join the Sorceress Kingdom if the Sorceress Kingdom recognized the empire in its whole state. By the way, Frian said, have there been any interesting goings-on regarding Riestais? What do you mean? Ludmilla asked. It's been long enough since the Battle of Katza Plains for them to digest the new realities of the region, Frian answered. We haven't heard anything on our end, but there must surely be hundreds of noble houses who have made friendly overtures to the Sorceress Kingdom, especially the ones close to your shared borders. Strangely enough, no. That's super weird, Dimir said. It should be clear which way things are going. There's nothing that Riestais can do if the Sorceress Kingdom offers its nobles a superior contract. You guys should have droves of nobles trying to join. I did mention how stubborn they've been about pursuing any relations with us, Ludmilla said. If they won't even agree to regular economic exchange, political maneuvering is out of the question. Frian exchanged pointed looks with Dimir and Rangobart. There was no way that was possible. The only thing that kept Riestais' nobles from openly declaring for the Empire was the fact that they were physically cut off from the Empire by the Azalisia Mountains and the Duchy of Erantal. With the Sorceress Kingdom, that wasn't a concern. The most likely answer to the puzzle was that the Sorceress Kingdom was planning on taking Riestais in one piece. They probably had an insider that they planned to install as Riestais' new sovereign, ruling over the kingdom as a client state in a similar arrangement as the Sorceress Kingdom had with the Empire. Ramposa has been sitting on the matter of succession for years. One of the princes must have jumped at the chance to strike a deal with the Sorceress Kingdom. If so, it would be the second prince, Zainak. Reports made to the court council indicated that he was far superior to his brother, Barbaro, but Barbaro was the rightful heir and had support that the king couldn't ignore. The rise of a pretender through marriage with one of the royal princesses was also a distant possibility. Or the Sorceress Kingdom could be colluding with the monster herself. After a moment's thought, Frian decided that was the most likely case. While they had adopted the laws of Riestais, the Sorceress Kingdom had not adopted its customs and had no reason to. The Empire's dealings with their suzerain over the past year made it clear that they valued talent over tradition. Riestais would be ruled by Queen Rina sooner or later. It was only a question of when she would take power and how it would happen. The Sorceress Kingdom could easily support a coup, but their actions since their appearance showed that it wasn't the way they operated. If anything, they simply wanted a hegemony of largely autonomous states built upon a strong economic foundation. Their chatter died down as a rugged-looking man came up the stairs. He made an awkward bow before delivering his report. The next patrol is ready to sortie, Miss Gran. Nemel rose from her seat. Anything to report from last night? She asked. No, ma'am, the man replied. Things are quiet as usual. The closest thing to trouble is the ogre tribe across the river, but they're still keeping to themselves. I see. What about the Sunrock tribe? There's been no trace of their raiding parties since our boys licked them upriver last week. You got raided? Rangobart asked. We did, Nemel answered. The big tribe on this side of the upper reaches has been expanding since mid-spring. That's terrible. Frian said, aren't they fellow subjects of the Sorceress Kingdom? The upper reaches is a special administrative zone that retains many of the traditional practices of the local tribes, Ludmilla said. This side of Mount Verilyn is technically a part of the upper reaches. But I'm all right with it, strangely enough, Nemel said. Frian gave Nemel an incredulous look. Why? Isn't this an unnecessary expenditure of resources? Not to mention exposing your people to the threat of injury and death. Nemel laughed and waved her hand dismissively. It's not as if we're fighting a war, she said. Think of it like Imperial Army patrols, I guess. Most of the raids consist of unlicensed hunters poaching our game and us chasing them off. If you require security, Frian said, just employ Death Knights. There are hundreds of them in Warden's Vale. This might sound weird, Nemel said, but I think things are fine the way that they are. The goblins volunteered for it in the first place and it's good for them. I don't see how it could be good for them. The pride that it creates is important, Nemel said. It gives people definition. A sense of ownership. Just letting everyone enjoy everything freely and without consequence leads to detachment and decadence. Maybe I'm explaining this poorly. I get what you're saying, Rangobart said. Most of the Imperial Knights think the same way. Even with the Death Series servitors being incorporated into the army, no one wants to quit. If anything, they've become more competitive. These two military idiots. Rangobart was a man who pursued a career in the army, so Frian expected some of that thinking out of him. but it looked like Nemel had caught the Imperial Knight's collective stupidity from her brief period of service, as well. Frianne was startled by a collective stomp that sounded as Nemel went to the railing of the balcony. Unbeknownst to Frianne, a group of goblins had gathered in the clearing below them. "Is that a goblin company?" Rangobart asked. "Something like that," Nemel smiled and waved at the goblins. At first, they formed squads. Once there were enough squads, they formed companies. No one asked them to, they just banded together like that on their own. The little green demi-humans formed a neat, 10 by 10 square and offered a salute to Nemel. On the right side of each rank was a goblin atop a big, black wolf. Beside them was another goblin in shamanistic garb. "Squads of 10 with one rider and one druid each," Rangobart murmured. "All this company is missing is its captain. That's supposedly a hobgoblin's role," Nemel said. "We don't have any yet, but Lady Zaradnik says that she's killed thousands of them, so there are bound to be more around. Actually, I'm not even sure how hobgoblins happen. They just appear in the Imperial Air Service's study materials without an explanation about what causes them to appear. This is probably how you end up with hobgoblins." Frianne's familiarity with the topic was a mix of cursory education, common knowledge, and old folklore, but it all pointed to the idea that advanced goblinoids tended to appear as regular goblin populations grew numerous. Not only did hobgoblins appear to lead them, but bugbears showed up to supplement their ranks with the brutish strength that goblins lacked. Monsters and magical beasts with special relationships to goblins, such as barghests, bourgets, and wargs, also appeared. Curiously, everything that manifested with large numbers of goblins was also known to eat goblins, but the goblins didn't seem to mind. "So does this company patrol for your village's surroundings?" Rangobart asked, "or all of Dame Verulin's fief?" "Dame Verulin made me seneschal of a roughly 50-kilometer span of the valley below Mount Verulin," Nemel answered. "It's only the north side of the river that joins with the Katzahir, but it's still a good 300 square kilometers or so of ground to cover." "That's a lot of land," Rangobart said. "It's twice the size of your family's barony." "I know, right? When we first discussed what I would be doing here, Dame Verulin said it was about 10 villages worth. What I didn't realize was that it was 10 Wardensvale's villages worth. It's a good thing she's a dragon. The Imperial administration would have pestered me endlessly about developing the land as quickly as possible. Not that I'm slacking or anything." "Does this whole company patrol together, or do they split up into squads?" "They patrol as a loose group," Nemel replied. "It takes 3 days to go upriver and 3 more days to come back down. They also camp for 2 days in our little harbor village here and 2 days at an outpost that they've established at the eastern end of my territory." "And setting all of that up took a bare handful of months?" Rangobart frowned. "How many of these companies do you have?" "There are 10 of them at the moment. Also, I told you before, right? The goblins do a lot of this stuff on their own. Rather than organizing them, they sort of organize around me." "Didn't you say that you had around 10,000 goblins in your territory?" "Yeah. They're spread out across the forests in the territory, so it isn't as if the companies are patrolling for no reason." "Was House Gran always so militant? Or Nemel, for that matter? Back at the academy, she mostly registered as timid and harmless when it came to politics between the scions. Most, including Frianne, figured that she would graduate with a respectable academic record and live the relatively quiet, undisturbed life that members of House Gran tended to lead on the surface. The fact that she had joined the Imperial Air Service may have indicated that she always had a militant streak beneath her innocent guise. Roughly 1% of the Empire's population was directly involved in the Imperial Army. Nemel, on the other hand, had 10% of her goblin population serving in her growing private army. Frianne examined the goblin company arrayed below the balcony. They weren't anywhere near as well equipped as Imperial Knights, but their armament was still probably enough to give their opponents pause. The wolf cavalry was equipped lightly with bows and demolances, while the infantry was half heavy and half light. Each member of the light infantry was equipped as a hunter with leather armor and a shortbow. Their heavy infantry counterparts also wore leather armor, but each also bore a body-length kite shield, sported steel half-helms, and held a steel-headed boar spear. Once their inspection was completed, the goblin company marched off in an orderly column through the village. Nemel had her hands on her hips, displaying a satisfied expression as they disappeared into the forest to the east. "Are you sure that they aren't going off to fight a war somewhere?" Dimir asked. If the Empire encountered those guys on the frontier, Rangobart added, there'd be quite the panic. Every village in the area would be screaming for protection. They probably would, Nemel agreed. But have you ever thought of it the other way around? The Imperial Army regularly patrols the frontier and their companies are far more intimidating. Why is it unacceptable for goblins to do the same thing in the eyes of Imperial frontiersmen? The only time that my goblins fight is if a fight comes to them, but the Imperial Army will preemptively strike at what they consider imminent threats. People's actions are informed by what they believe, Ludmilla said. Fortunately, what they believe isn't necessarily set in stone. The Empire's expansionary policies have led to antagonistic relationships with its neighbors, but General Ray's battalion adapted quickly enough to the presence of demi-human allies. As have Nemel's settlers. I won't be so naive as to demand that you should give everyone the benefit of the doubt with no regard to security, but sticking to untested preconceptions has a way of closing doors that one might otherwise benefit from. Now that I've seen the company off, Nemel said, we can take a look around the village. It's nothing near as grand as our winter, but I like how cozy it's become. Their first stop was a long, hall-like structure constructed out of wood. It was completely functional in its appearance, and stepping inside immediately made that function clear. Rows of long tables with chairs facing forward were occupied by humans and goblins alike. Fendros was standing before a board at the front, reciting the letters written upon it. I was wondering where she disappeared to, Frianne said. Everyone has work to do here, Nemel said. It's quiet, but busy at the same time. Ray spends most of her time in the village teaching classes. She also frequents our office in Warden's Vale, traveling around while seeing what she can find with her talent. I don't recall her having a talent. It wasn't anything that she was particularly proud of back in the Empire, Nemel said. Master Paradine and Arch both had superior versions of her talent, so she didn't talk about it much out of fear of looking pathetic. A frown pulled at Frianne's lips as Nemel spoke. Are you saying that she has the same type of eye power? Frianne asked, the one that allows one to visualize arcane potential? Yes, that one. It doesn't work all the time, so even her parents saw it as useless. If she teaches the same students every day, however, it's bound to trigger. Right. Frianne's fingers came up to pinch the bridge of her nose. Ludmilla had mentioned that they had someone who could do that, but Frianne never imagined that it was someone from the Empire. How could something like that have happened? The Empire had lost an invaluable talent holder, one that could have significantly altered several generations of its caster demographic now that Frianne was the head court mage. It's because she's from an attainted house. First Arch, now Fendros. How much has the Empire lost? Once again, the Empire's heavy-handed policies were proven to be self-destructive. Entire noble lines were attainted for political and ideological reasons and effectively erased in the eyes of the imperial administration. No one would associate with them out of fear of being purged themselves, and little to no effort was made to salvage promising individuals. Kill 1, warn 100 was the order of the day, and it had been that way for over a decade. How many arcane casters has she identified? Frianne asked. Roughly 1 in 3 have the potential for magic, Nemel answered. They are common to the point where we have to limit how many arcane casters we train, or else we wouldn't have enough tradespeople for the village. Lady Zaradnik also mentioned something about those already committed to other professions being better off doing what they were doing. Do you think it would be possible for the Empire to borrow Fendros once in a while? Even if the Empire had to pay, it would be worth it to identify new magic casters. Nemel's lip twitched and she turned away to watch Fendros teach her class. After all that she and her friends have been put through, Nemel said, do you think you'll receive a favorable reply? The Empire destroyed their houses and their lives, consigning them to a fate that we would consider worse than death. Perhaps the Emperor believes that what he did to them was necessary and justified, but the children of the Attainted will never forgive him for his actions. With a new set of troubles on her mind, Frianne followed Nemel out of the schoolhouse to continue their tour of her village. She was still wary of the goblins that scampered about, but the human residents, at least the ones that she could see, paid no special attention to them. Out of the members of her party, Rangobart looked like he was trying to emulate the aloofness of the villagers' men, while Dimir seemed to be caught between trying to avoid the little demi-humans and thinking of climbing up into the trees to see what they were doing. How long does it take for the goblins to learn stuff in the classroom? Dimir asked. None of them have completed their basic education yet, Nemel replied. None of the migrants have either. It has only been a few months since we got here, after all. Do you truly plan on educating all of them? Rangobart asked. You made it sound as if scores of new goblins arrive every day. I'm hoping that the way they pick up skills from one another will help speed things along. The most pressing concern right now is figuring out how to specialize their sorcerers. What do you mean by that? Frian asked. A goblin's advantages also become disadvantages depending on what they're doing, Nemel answered. For instance, their penchant for spreading useful skills also applies to how they spread magic. Once one goblin sorcerer learns a spell, all of their sorcerer friends learn the spell shortly after. This sort of dooms them to being generalists unless what they learn is strictly controlled, and that control is seemingly impossible to achieve at the moment because they learn by feeling. All they have to do is catch one of us or one of the Elder Liches casting a spell to begin figuring it out. I wouldn't be surprised if a few of them started flying around soon. It shouldn't be that bad, Rangobart said. Imperial patrols rarely encounter goblin sorcerers. Those wielding second-tier spells are nearly unheard of. The unbridled way in which goblins tend to learn should explain that, Ludmilla said. Goblin sorcerers may end up learning how to be rangers, too, and those rangers that they learn from might also be leatherworkers. While this may be useful for survival as a goblin in the wilderness, it isn't so great when being pitted against societies of specialists for specific tasks. General Ray's battalion was shocked to find out that most goblins were more like simple villagers rather than the bloodthirsty marauders of their imaginations. I'm not going to discover that the 6th Army Group is half goblins, am I? Rangobart asked. Probably not, Ludmilla said. I brought all of the goblins and mountain trolls that I recruited back home with me. General Ray will have to figure out how to get his own. Their next stop was a large lumberyard on the outskirts of the village. A well-worn road connected it to the nearby pier. Frian frowned as she realized that several things were off about it. I don't see any raw timber. There was plenty of lumber cut to different dimensions, but no trees in sight. Everyone in the yard was working on producing furniture, construction materials, and smaller pieces of woodwork. In one corner, a man watched a goblin use a lathe to produce staves for spears. It isn't processed here, Nemel said. Raw timber is shipped across the river and delivered to the dam. It's cheaper to hire the mill than it is to build and operate our own. Another practical demonstration of undead labor's applications, I suppose, Rangobart said. Yeah, Nemel nodded. I still couldn't quite believe it when I calculated everything out on paper. The economics of everything changes so much when animal feed and wages for transport staff are removed from the equation. Facilities can be built in previously unimaginable places. Anyone who administers a territory on a navigable river understands that, Rangobart said. I'm already of the mind that the undead can make this applicable anywhere. It sounds like you already have something planned for your new territory, Nemel said. Rangobart nodded. Constructing a mill that services the surrounding territories should be a safe and profitable bet. You are aiming straight for a town? Nemel raised an eyebrow. That's very ambitious. It should work out. I may not know what my territory contains, but I do know where it is and what's around it. The court council stuck to a handful of simple rules in their rush to hand out all of those titles. One of those rules was to space out the unlanded scions serving in the 2nd Army Group. I assume that the Imperial administration hopes that we will seize the opportunity to spearhead the development effort, acting as an example for the regular Imperial Knights and the fiefs around ours. That much should be obvious, Frian said. The scions in the Imperial Army will save the administration a lot of work by putting their upbringing and academy education to work in their territories. Newly landed commoners spend a lot of time agonizing over what they want to do. It was a very clever ploy on Rangobart's part. While any scion should have recognized the intent of the Imperial administration, most would have endeavored to make their new domain stand head and shoulders above their neighbors through direct comparisons of traditional development. It was something that a scion knew they had an advantage in, as the senescals provided by the Imperial administration still relied on the input and approval of their respective lieges. With such an advantage, martial scions hoped to steadily build up their political and economic clout, playing the great game of houses in the straightforward way that the Imperial Knights did. Rangobart, on the other hand, planned to skip that arduous process entirely. Building a mill powered by the undead and foregoing traditional development would minimize the demand for settlers and the infrastructure required to support them. Combined with the judicious use of undead logistics, the mill would become the most economical choice for regional processing. The Senescals in the surrounding territories would pick up on that cue and accelerate development with a confidence inspired by greater returns. In other words, he wasn't playing the same game as his neighbors. Instead, he was creating a catalyst for regional development and aiming to become the main urban center in the area. With the profits from his mill, he would be able to subsidize other industries, unexpectedly snatching business away from the distant imperial heartlands and transforming his territory into a center of urban industry and commerce. Don't you think someone else might be considering the same strategy? Frian asked. It matters little even if they did, Rangobat answered. I'll be hiring the Sorceress Kingdom's Adventurer Guild to survey my holdings far ahead of the vast majority. I also have coupons to distribute to the neighboring fiefs. I'll have the full backing of the Imperial administration because it will be clear that I'm using a superior model of development. Barring some catastrophe, I've already won. But your territory sounds like it's on fire, Dimir said. Quiet, you. Aside from the lumber yard, the only other workshop in the village was a potter. Nemel also said that there was a tanner somewhere conveniently downwind of any residences. What are your long-term plans for this territory? Frian asked. I don't see any construction that suggests what might come next. Everything you see now is just our preparation for the winter, Nemel said. I have another wave of migrants coming from our winter in a couple of months. Every Imperial migrant living here will have a cozy home of their own by the time we get any snow, hopefully. How about the goblins? Dimir asked. What they do will be up to them, Nemel said. I half expect them to do something crazy that we'd never think of. If they do end up needing shelter, however, it wouldn't take much effort to build longhouses for them. Making sure there will be enough food for everyone is the more pressing concern. So all of the industrial activity we see will continue over the winter? It might slow down a bit. I'm actually worried about what might come down from Mount Verilyn. As you can tell, it's much cooler here in the summer than in our winter. We might end up getting buried in snow or ice elementals. Actually, that might be good. Frian tilted her head up to take in the ice-bound massif above them. How would that be good? She asked. It has to do with our future plans, Nemel answered. Both Lady Zaradnik and Dame Verilyn prefer to keep things natural. My mother suggested that I take up the family business here and I agree that it's one of the more promising avenues for development. What's the family business? Ludmilla asked. They deal in death. Dimir answered. Nemel gave her former next-door neighbor a swat. Not precisely. We mainly sell wands and staves to the Imperial Army. Most of them are loaded with war magic. That sounds very promising, Ludmilla said. I wasn't aware that you came from a family of war mages. It's a quiet life, ironically. I don't think my parents have been in a single battle. It's not going to be a very quiet life if you constantly get attacked by ice elementals, Rangobat noted. The Goblin patrols need more challenging fights, Nemel said. And a reliable supply of elemental ice would be great for advanced magic item production. It's not like we would have much of a choice, anyway. Ice elementals overrunning the lower valley would make winter unbearable and keeping them away might make things milder. Won't you have a problem with Nemel's people fighting against nature, Zaradnik? Frian asked. It's an overextension of the local ice gradient that must be addressed, Ludmilla answered. Though, you probably shouldn't tell Dame Verilyn about this. You're right. She might freeze us solid hoping for more tax revenue. My initial proposal for this territory was normal. How did it get like this? I don't think she's that greedy, Ludmilla said, but she could adversely alter your growing season by trying to get just a little bit more. Only in the Sorceress Kingdom would they speak so casually about altering the seasons. Then again, the Empire might have as well if the former head court mage had cared enough to learn control weather. At least they were talking about a dragon here. The fluffy thing nuzzled Frian's arm, and her hand came up to respond to its demands for attention. She idly wondered if it was possible to get one of her own. So, Nemel said, where is everyone going next? The southern port for lunch, Ludmilla said. After that, we'll be going over the ancient pass to observe the expedition. Have they watched a league match yet? Nemel asked. I know for a fact that Dimir and the Prez love that sort of thing. The official league match is in 2 days, Ludmilla answered, so I figured I'd save the experience for then. You should try and bring your people too. The matches are starting to become a small event in themselves. I'll see what I can do, Nemel replied. Most of the new migrants won't stray too far from their homes yet, though. Nemel accompanied them back to the pier. Frian, her eyes long grown accustomed to the gloom of the forest, squinted in the light of the mid-morning sun. Thank you for coming to visit, everyone, Nemel smiled. With luck, I'll see you all at the match. I was hoping that we would be able to see Astzazza before we left, Ludmilla said. He left 5 days ago, Nemel said. The river trade is doing well, so don't expect he'll be back for a few days yet. If you're lucky, he might still be at the South Port. They flew back to their carriage in the lot across the river. Frian shifted in her seat as they continued south down the road following the river. A kilometer of forest was cleared to either side of the road, offering travelers a magnificent view of the surroundings. Frian focused her gaze on the Katsa River as it collected its tribute from the highland basin. Nemel mentioned that there was trade along the river, she said, but I haven't been able to spot any settlements along the way so far. Expecting camps of intrepid frontier folk collecting meat and furs? Ludmilla asked. Well, yes, now that you mention it. Beside her, the frontier noble smiled slightly. There, she said. You are just looking on the wrong side of the river. Astzazza's river trade primarily deals with the tribes encamped on the eastern banks of the river. The tribes? What do they trade? Meat and furs? Ludmilla replied, herbs and other alchemical reagents that they've been able to identify, as well. Aside from a few things, they export the same things that my people did before the Battle of Katsa Plains. And what do they import? Frian asked. The same things that my people did before the Battle of Katsa Plains, Ludmilla replied. Aside from a few things, the look of fond reminiscence in Ludmilla's voice sent a disturbing chill down Frian's spine, but she couldn't pin the source of the feeling. Exports to a frontier territory, Rangopart. Without imperial knights. Does that mean you're arming these tribes? Ultimately, yes. Astzazza may be the one trading with them, but many goods come from Warden's Vale. Frian's mouth fell open, aghast. But they're your subjects. She said, do you mean to say that you're profiteering from the raids that they conduct on one another? From a certain point of view, Ludmilla said. The intent, however, is to observe how the tribal societies here evolve as they are increasingly exposed to our economy and culture. Observe. She had been exposed to many bizarre things during her visit to Ludmilla's territory, but this was perhaps the strangest of them all. Was Ludmilla ruthlessly pursuing the doctrines of the 6 great gods by accelerating the butchery that occurred between her demi-human subjects? No, considering that she expressed the desire to integrate the wilderness tribes, it might have been that she was imposing the other thing that the faith of the 6 was infamous for. The weak would be culled, the strong would form the foundation of new bloodlines. Learning is important, is it not? Ludmilla asked. To you and I, human behavior is well documented. There is little material to be had on tribal demi-humans, however. Frontier folk are considered experts on them, but I've only ever learned how to deter and destroy my neighbors. In particular, I'm curious how they'll adopt monetization and commerce. The Sorceress Kingdom has already done something similar in the north, haven't they? Rangobat said. Countess Wagner mentioned that a trade network was already set up there. That was the tribal demi-humans being coaxed into integration, Ludmilla said. What I wish to know is what they'll do on their own. To what end? Frian said, it isn't as if there aren't other countries out there with demi-human populations. If you'd like to save some time figuring out what demi-humans will do with civilization, just pay Carnassus a visit. There is little justice in that, Ludmilla replied. How would you feel if the Sorceress Kingdom made a study of the slain theocracy and then told the Baharuth Empire that their way was the right way to do things? My people will decide who they are, and I'm doing everything within my power to ensure that each individual will be able to make an informed choice. And while they figure out who they are, she lets them kill one another? Fight over territory like savage tribes? Well, I suppose that's what they are. The vista of the river valley subtly shifted in her mind, the shadow of unseen threats falling over the flowering meadows. Was it even safe to be traveling through a place where violence could erupt without warning? Is that a recommendation for imperial policy? Rangobat asked. I'm not recommending anything, Ludmilla answered. I'm doing what I think is right, and it does not fall out of line with my rights and responsibilities as a noble of the Sorceress Kingdom. I also highly doubt that the Court Council would appreciate my approach. The 6th Army Group is primed to spark a golden age of Imperial expansion and, considering the character of the Imperial administration and the Empire's history, they will hardly spare any consideration for the conquered. That's Saradnik speak for you. Are probably going to regret it, Rangobart said. But you're also right that Imperial policy will be difficult to change in this regard. It doesn't have to be, Ludmilla said. The seeds have already been planted. All we need now are hands patient enough to cultivate them to fruition. Wait a minute, you planned all of that? I only played my part. Rangobart leaned back in his seat, blowing out a long sigh. I suppose you were also involved in my reassignment to the 6th Army Group. I wasn't, but it's good to know that you'll be out there with them. I'm going to end up just as paranoid as my cousin. Jerkniv commonly remarked that everyone was merely a puppet dancing in the palm of the Sorcerer King's bony hand, but it was impossible to believe that claim. As time passed, however, so many things went in his favor that it was impossible not to believe there was the master plan of some unfathomable intellect. They rode in silence until they reached an island in a lake. A long bridge connected it to the shore on both sides. The island was divided into 3 mostly unbuilt tiers, with the highest section occupying its southern end. Their destination, however, brought them to the northern edge of the island, where a small settlement overlooked a tiny port on the island's lowest tier. Another terraformed locale? Frian asked. That's right, Ludmilla replied. This island is meant to become the urban hub for the upper reaches. Frian eyed the passing buildings warily, but the place appeared to be wholly populated by humans. Like the farming villages in Warden's Vale, it had all of the amenities of a town with only the population of a village. They stopped at a restaurant built in the all-too-familiar architectural style of Ludmilla's territory and settled down around a simple wooden table while they waited for their meal. Which way is the ancient pass that you mentioned? Frian asked. I noticed that the road is built out in both directions from here. It's up the valley to the west, Ludmilla said. The road southeast leads to the slain theocracy. Do you get any traffic from them? No, Ludmilla replied. This route isn't worth it for merchants, yet. From what I hear about the theocracy's people, the presence of demi-humans will make it an unattractive route even when we're finally connected to the Holy Kingdom. I'm not sure how many generations or even centuries it will take for their cultural views to transform into something more amenable. You seem to come around in no time, Rangobard noted. I used to think the same, Ludmilla said. It wasn't until the paladins from the theocracy came over that I learned just how different it is down there. We may be of the same faith, but nearly 2 centuries of being apart have created vast differences between us. In many aspects, they are as foreign to me as they probably are to you. I've been there once, Rangobard said. They seemed normal enough, aside from the religion thing. That's what Clara said, as well, Ludmilla replied. Aside from the religion thing. As far as I can tell, they seem normal enough because they assume that you're on humanity's side and they aren't exactly wrong. It is only when one distinguishes oneself as different that the rumored behavior of their citizens comes out. So even if you share the same faith, you're opposed to their ways? The people of Reistais and the Empire share the same faith, Ludmilla noted. That didn't stop them from going to war every year. Not that we intend to wage war against the theocracy. Corlin has been working hard to maintain cordial relations with them. Not only is she working to restore commercial ties, but she also supports charitable causes across the border. Frian supposed that was how it had to be done. The theocracy wouldn't tolerate any diplomatic efforts directly spearheaded by the undead. Still, she doubted that Clara would get far with her efforts given the dogmatic, human-centric nature of their southern neighbor. How far is the theocracy from here, anyway? Dimir asked. From this spot? Over 50 kilometers to their frontier. Nearly twice that if one takes the road. We're far enough apart that our border patrols never come close to seeing theirs. What about the expedition? Rangobart asked. Are your adventurers allowed to get close to foreign countries uninvited? That's a somewhat complicated question, Ludmilla answered. One of the purposes of the expeditions is to meet new people, after all. If a foreign power demands that our adventurers stay away, they will. Otherwise, they'll attempt some sort of friendly exchange. In the case of the expedition on the other side of the ancient pass, they're 100 kilometers upriver of the Theocracy's frontier. The chances of running into Theocracy forces are slim to none. They quickly finished with their meals and their carriage doubled back on their route, heading east at a junction they had passed before turning onto the bridge to the island. Frian eyed the freshly cleared route as they steadily made their way along a rapid-infested river flowing into the lake behind them. Far ahead was a wide saddle in a mountain range that cleared the tree line. You referred to this as the Ancient Pass, Frian said. Is it in any way related to the ancient empire that you're learning about? I have no idea, Ludmilla replied. We excavated the old road leading to the Ancient Pass, but the pieces give no indication of what they were beyond being the remains of an old road. The haunted forest on the other side hosts a multitude of overgrown and buried ruins, so I'm hoping that we'll have better luck there. A lost country? Dimir asked. Elves, maybe. It takes a calamitous event to create a persistent negative energy zone of that scale, Ludmilla answered. So I wouldn't be surprised that a country formerly stood where the haunted forest is. The location seems ideal for any number of races in the region, however. Have you found any powerful relics? The reports haven't indicated anything of the sort, Ludmilla replied, but we've just gotten started and a thorough investigation might take years. I'd consider the discovery of an intact historical record the greatest treasure. Cresting the top of the pass revealed a gentle, forested slope that ended at a small river. Beyond it was a vast grassland that stretched beyond the horizon. The sight of it was entirely unexpected of what the region termed a wilderness. Who lives in that plain over there? Frian asked. It's a hunting ground for the monsters and magical beasts that live in the mountains nearby, Ludmilla answered. Primarily wyverns and manticores. Are there any dragons? Rangobart asked. No. For various reasons, this area has been inhospitable to dragons in the past. Frian clutched the fluffy thing on her lap, wondering what could possibly be so dangerous that dragons considered the area hostile to habitation. This forest doesn't look very haunted, Dimir said. Have you been to a haunted forest before? No. Well, this is what they look like, Ludmilla said. The forest is a source of positive energy that constantly cancels out the negative energy. Undead and negative energy-related phenomena only manifest where the concentrations of negative energy can overwhelm what the forest can produce. Presumably, those locations are where the greatest atrocities against the living were committed. Their passenger wagon went all the way to the bank of the river that they had spotted from the pass. Inventories of construction materials were arranged along the shore and the road itself ended at a partially constructed bridge. It took Frian several moments to spot the fortified camp that served as the adventurer base. It doesn't feel very adventurous when this expedition is sitting right next to a construction site, Rangobart said. We needed them to survey ahead of our highway construction for important ruins, Ludmilla said, so this is how it turned out. As they made their way toward the expedition base, the fluffy thing in Frian's arms started to squirm. She tried to calm it down by petting it and making comforting sounds, but it eventually escaped her grip. Instead of falling to the ground, however, it floated into the air. Frian, Dimir, and Rangobart gaped silently as it receded into a white dot against the cloudless sky. Is something the matter? Ludmilla asked. The fluffy. Dimir pointed. It flew away. It happens, Ludmilla replied. Let's get you introduced to the expedition, shall we?